Hello, my name is John Didi, professor of political science at the community colleges of Baltimore County and local political analyst. Welcome to the Maryland State Politics and Government podcast on Substack. Today, I am talking with a candidate for the Maryland State Senate, Jason Fowler. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. How you doing, John?
Can't complain. First question I want to ask is why are you running for the Senate?
Sure. It's not a decision I've made lightly. I have a beautiful family and a successful law practice here in Southern Maryland. Quite candidly, there's a lot of reasons to stay on the sidelines in 2026, but ultimately I can't do that. Our state and our district and its three counties are at a serious inflection point. We are facing a series of crises that imperil the future of our state and the quality of life that we want for our families and the value that we share as Marylanders. First, and I think most obviously, Maryland is experiencing an affordability crisis. Too many people are priced out of living in our state. We're a high tax state with some of the most expensive housing, energy, and grocery prices in the country. And families are being forced to leave the state simply because they can't afford to live here. And for many people who have stayed, they are finding it difficult, if not impossible, to pay their bills and put food on the table, send their kids off to school, and put away enough for retirement to retire with dignity. The second thing that I think is important and what Maryland is experiencing is an economic crisis. And taking a hatchet to the federal government, the Trump administration has taken a hatchet to our economy as well here in the state. We've lost 25,000 federal civilian workers in the last year, with severe consequences to our private sector and our state and local budgets. The 27th district is uniquely vulnerable to this upheaval. We benefit from proximity to a lot of our federal government institutions at NASA Goddard, the Census Bureau, the Naval Surface Warfare Center, and so many more throughout the region, which also makes us disproportionately reliant on these private sector companies that have grown around the installations as well as those government installations. The reemergence, of our $1.5 billion budget deficit and far bigger deficits looming on the horizon due to the blueprint and others further confirms the obvious, is that we cannot count on this old government-centric economic model. We have to fundamentally rethink our approach. We have to put in work to become a more welcoming destination for small businesses, relocating corporations to our shores, and emerging entrepreneurs. Finally, I think Maryland is facing a human crisis. Donald Trump and his administration, I think, pose an existential threat to everything that we stand for, not just as Americans, but also as Marylanders. The rule of law, the sanctity of due process, and the belief that all human beings are equal. The basic principles of our democracy. In the absence of a functioning federal government, it is increasingly up to us and states to put a check and serve as a fortress against the most unconscionable elements of this administration and to be a guardian for its core values. I believe, John, that in times of crises, that people of conviction and of ideas step up to lead. I believe that my values, my priorities, and my vision are compatible with those of the families of the 27th district. And I believe, in my experience, both as a private and public sector person, that will enable me to deliver for constituents in the district, and that we'll have the grassroots supports, the resources financially, and the right message to win this race.
27th district is a wide-ranging district covering three different counties and a variety of different people, issues, etc. You talked about affordability. You also talked about, looking at the budget, making some cuts and things like that. You also referenced the Trump administration. From the people you talk to in the district, is there any one thing that gets brought up a lot more often that they really focus on? They basically say, Jason, we really need you to focus on this.
So I would say in our region, what is very important is that, we have historically been a commuter area for the Washington metro area and for many of those installations I mentioned. So one of the things I see that is very common is that infrastructure becomes highly important. Traffic becomes highly important. Getting from one place to another. A lot of people in our region commute pretty far to go to work. If you're in Charles County, you're going up, Route 5 and 210 to get into the district. If you're in Calvert County, you're going up Route 4. And if you're in Prince George's, you're somehow trying to get around the 495 corridor to get into the DC area. So making sure that we have our infrastructure is in place, that's very important. But also the affordability of that process. And are we making that easier for our communities as a whole? I think that's a big component and what many of the people in our region need is to make sure that they can get to and from work in a safe and expeditious manner so they can spend the time that they need to with their families while still earning a good living so they can actually afford to live here. I think all too often we are seeing our paychecks are not going farther for every single expense that we see. And I think the fact that we are very limitedly addressing this in Annapolis, I think is a huge misstep, in my opinion.
One of the things you talked about before when discussing things was you referenced the blueprint, and you also referenced that some cuts have to be made in general to the budget.
Sure.
What changes would you make to the blueprint, and what items would you look to cut in the budget?
I mean, ultimately, when we look at the budget, obviously it's a $70 billion budget. So there's always somewhere where we can look into the budget to find something to cut away. But in terms of the blueprint, I want to say this. I'm a supporter of public education, and I'm a supporter of making sure that we fund the blueprint appropriately. But we also have to have a conversation of when we're passing legislation in Annapolis, why are we not passing legislation that is budget friendly and budget sound when the legislation is going in place? The blueprint was passed years ago, around the first time I ran for office, in fact, around 2018. So why are we now trying to clean up the mess from two administrations that have not even been here? Two sets of legislatures that haven't been here. So when you look at our budget deficits going forward, we had a $1.5 billion deficit now. We're projected to have anywhere from $2.3 billion in the upcoming years, all the way up to a $4.1 billion projected budget for 2031. So we are continuously going to see issues with this budget, and Maryland is going to have to determine whether we're going to raise taxes and or cut, or we're going to find other streams of revenue. And I don't see, at least right now, a viable option coming from the state in terms of what our process is going to look like. I see that we have been raising fees and we have raised taxes on, small businesses in certain aspects, but that's the worst way to raise revenue, frankly, in my opinion. And I'm sure that would be shared with others who have a background in tax like I do, that's the hardest way to raise money if they're going to add more money to the pile. I would like to see, utilization of sales tax model. I think that's the best way that we can raise money. We can also find, avenues within our budget to make conscious cuts. I think we have to be aware, and part of doing this job is making hard decisions and making sure that we're fiscally sound. And that's what Marylanders expect from their legislatures when they go to Annapolis, not just to ask them for more money, but to figure out how they're getting value out of the money that they're paying to the state.
One of the issues that's come up recently is the redistricting situation. The House passed something a couple days ago, and right now the bill is going to the Senate, but it's not going anywhere. Do you feel that the bill should get a vote in the Senate? How do you feel about this whole redistricting process?
Well, I'm never a fan of one piece of our legislature not respecting the other. I think if the House puts a bill up, I think the Senate should at least vote on it. And I think similarly, if the Senate is putting legislation through, it should get a read in the House. These bodies should be working together. And frankly, I think the people of Maryland deserve to know how their senators feel on these topics. And if the House has passed a bill, then the Senate should follow its obligations and at least put it to a vote.
One issue that's come up a lot as far as what people have talked about in the northern part of the state, the Baltimore area, is energy. The issue of rising BG&E prices at the same time, power plants closing at the same time, people say, hey, we need to look at nuclear a little bit more. What are your thoughts as far as what type of energy policy the state should have going forward?
It's a great question, John. And a timely question at that. So one of the things I think we should do is we should be looking backwards in our own legislation. So in 2024, there was a bill that came up called the Warmth Act. and it's House Bill, I think it's 397. That bill was basically, it creates a mandate for our power suppliers in the state to invest in geothermal technology in our cities. And I think this is a great avenue that we could use to, one, reduce the cost of energy pricing in the area, but also use it by using our natural resources and something that's not as cost prohibitive. Geothermal energy could be utilized throughout many of our larger cities. Baltimore is a great example. Throughout Prince George's County, not necessarily in my district, but in other parts of the district that are more densely populated. Montgomery County would be another option as well. And I think that would be a great way for us to invest. I am a proponent, and I am going to be putting forth legislation if elected, if and when elected, I should say, to increase nuclear power in the state. My home jurisdiction and my home county of Calvert has the only nuclear power facility in the whole state. We provide 40% of the state's electricity through one facility. And my proposal that we'll be putting forward would include 2 to 3 total nuclear power facilities to be utilized as backups while we also invest in green technology throughout the state. I want to make sure that we have viable options in the event that, like this past week where we've been iced in, that we have viable backups, but then also at the same time that we are investing in the technology of the future and making sure that we can leave a world that is better than the world that we inherited for our children, mine included and everyone else's.
One of the big issues facing the state when it comes to finances is Medicaid. 1 out of every 4 Marylanders is on Medicaid. How do you tackle something like that? How do you deal with an issue like that? What would you look at?
So kind of go back to our budget issue. One of our main issues with our budget has also been picking up the Medicaid expense. So what I would say in terms of Medicaid, there's a lot of different ways that we can handle it. We can look at other states that have done statewide single payer systems. Those can be expensive, but I think that's something that we can work with our federal partners with to see what avenues that may look like. But ultimately, I think when you talk to an everyday working person in America, a single payer health system is what we should be working towards. It is not only morally just, it is what should happen in the industrialized world. We see it across the world. We're the only industrialized country that does not guarantee health care for its citizens. And I think that Maryland can either be a leader in this regard, or we should step up on our federal level and make sure that we do this nationwide for all of our citizens. A good example for you, John, is my son was born with a kidney issue. And, he's very fortunate to live in my house because I can afford to take him and to do the routine medication that he needs and to go to specialists often to make sure that he's okay. I think a lot about, in the event that he wasn't born in my household and he was born in a household only making maybe $50,000 a year, what his prospects would be and whether or not he would be alive or whether or not he would not have the medication that he needs. And I think when we talk about healthcare policy specifically, we need to be very aware that every single thing that we do is lives are at stake. And that is the type of leadership I would bring to the Maryland Senate in this issue.
One of the issues that's come up recently is some of the stuff regarding state agencies, how they're spending money, the SNAP issue that has gone on. Do you believe the state of Maryland should have its own inspector general to do things and kind of mind the store a little bit?
Absolutely. I think ultimately, I've read varying reports in terms of, I wouldn't say malfeasance, but with erroneous spending that has gone unchecked and unreported to the tune of $1 billion, right? And it's very hard for me as a taxpayer to hear that we need more money to pay for services, and then at the same time hear that we've misappropriated funds to that extent, right? I mean, the current deficit was around $1.4 billion. So if our state had misused $1 billion and had properly tracked it, then we wouldn't be in that situation. So I do think that having some checks and balances is important. Ultimately, nobody's checkbook at home is this big and manages this level of operations. So I think having some fiscal watchdogs would be smart. I think any large company would do the same, and to ensure that they have compliance within their business, and I think Maryland should do the same.
Final question relates to a couple pieces of legislation the legislature has been dealing with, and it relates to ICE. The legislation regarding, cooperation, the legislation regarding to, hey, they shouldn't be wearing masks. Christy Nome today talked about that, hey, we're going to make sure they all have body cameras on. What are your thoughts about the legislation that has been voted on related to these matters?
So, in terms of masks, I think it is very important to make sure that when any individual is dealing with law enforcement or any official that is acting that could potentially restrict one's constitutional rights, that we should see their face, that we should see their badge number, and that they should have a camera attached to their body to ensure that they are practicing and they are operating within the confines of the law. Now, when I first started getting involved in Maryland politics, I advocated for body-worn cameras locally, and for a police accountability board in my local county here in Calvert County. And it took us years of pleading to get that to happen. Now, on the legal side, we have seen that body cameras have done more for police officers than they have for the public. They have exonerated police officers more often than the opposite has been true. Now, having said all of that, it is very important that we are making sure that anyone in a law enforcement capacity, that we have the ability to track their actions and make sure that they're doing their jobs properly. In terms of covering one's face, I do not like the idea that random people, specifically with ICE, can show up without badge numbers, covering their face, and essentially kidnapping people on the street without any real knowledge that they're working for ICE at all. I know that there were reports that said that there were vigilantes that were kind of randomly kidnapping people and robbing them under the guise of them being ICE agents. So I think from a public safety standpoint, I think we need to ensure that our police officers look the same and they act the same way, and that there's a set of guidelines that we apply. In regards to the other legislation that has gone on in Maryland with the 287G agreements between local authorities and the federal government, I would argue that I do not believe that the federal government should be deputizing our local law enforcement to operate under federal immigration law. I think if ICE is going to exist and operate as a border patrol agency, that they should hire their own staff and they should abide by the rules that we set on a federal level. But I don't believe that they should be utilizing state resources to tap into either their tax returns or figure out where they work, and then go track down citizens that live in our communities that have either been here for a long time, have contributed for a long time, and that are otherwise not breaking the law. Now, I recently posted something on our page about the people that have been arrested by ICE throughout the United States, and 75% of those individuals had no other criminal records whatsoever, no previous arrests, no prior history of criminality in our jurisdictions. And the reality is, when we look at issues across the country with ICE murdering citizens in our country, I think Maryland is right to step up and say that these are not values that we adhere to, and we are not going to work with federal partners who execute American citizens on American soil.
Thank you again for your time, and good luck on the campaign trail.
Thank you very much, John.